This evening we're continuing our study in which we're considering God's wisdom for various ages and stages of life. We've been working through a passage in Paul's letter to Titus, and so far we've looked at the message for seniors, the aged men and the aged women. The next group that the Apostle Paul addresses is the young women. In context, these are women who are old enough to get married and to have children. So the study this evening is specifically for young wives and young mothers and for women who one day hope to be. But there are also things for all of us to learn and to be reminded of. In Titus chapter 2 verses 4 and 5, the Apostle Paul mentions 7 things that are to characterise the life of a young Christian woman. And we're only going to consider the first 2 this evening. They're given in verse 4. But I'm going to read from verse 1 to set the context and to remind us of what we've covered in this study thus far. So the Bible says, Titus chapter 2, verse 1, "But speak thou the things which become sound doctrine, that the aged men be sober, grave, temperate, sound in faith, in charity, in patience. The aged women likewise, that they be in behaviour as becometh holiness, not false accusers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children." Young Christian women are to love their husbands if they're married and love their children if they have them. And this is what we're going to think about in this study. But before we get to these, I need to talk for a moment about the first statement in verse 4. The aged women are to be teachers of good things so that, or in order that, they may teach the young women to be sober. In our King James translation, it looks like the first thing that the aged women are to teach the young women is to be sober. But that's not quite the idea here. And besides, the Greek word for sober or self-controlled appears in verse 5. It's the word translated discreet. Now, it wouldn't make sense for Paul to give the same instruction twice in the same sentence. Now, there is just one Greek word translated teach to be sober. It's the word sophronizosin. It appears only here in the New Testament. It's a verb, and it means to make sane, to restore to one's senses, or to make of sound mind. It describes the kind of teaching that is to occur, and not so much the outcomes of that teaching. This is teaching that addresses the mind, teaching that helps one to think properly. Some other words that we might use here are to school, or to train, or to discipline. The aged women are to teach the young women to think and behave rightly. And the tense of the verb indicates an ongoing process, an ongoing relationship. It's not one little talk over a cup of coffee. It's not one information dump and it's done. No. This is akin to what we today would call mentoring. And the outcome of this mentoring, or what it's working towards, is young Christian women who love their husbands, who love their children, who are self-controlled and chaste, and so on. Now, at first glance, it might seem rather strange that Paul says this, that he directs Titus to instruct the aged women to teach this to the young women. We assume that young women who are married love their husbands and love their children. Why did this need to be taught? To use modern terminology, we kind of expect young married couples to still be in love, don't we? So why this instruction? Well, in Paul's day, there was one very big factor at play that made this teaching necessary, and some of you have probably already cottoned onto it. And that was the reality that in the Greco-Roman world, most marriages were arranged. Women didn't normally get to choose who they were married to. Now, that's not to say that every woman was forced to marry someone she didn't know or didn't like or wasn't attracted to, but we have to acknowledge that for many women it would have been very difficult. It would have been difficult to love the man they were married to and to love the children of their union. And this would have been especially the case if her husband was not a Christian. In Greek and Roman culture, men only had one wife, but it was common, even normal, for men to engage in sexual activity with slaves and prostitutes, male and female. So that gives some context to these instructions here in verse 4. We can see why Paul asked Titus to address this in the churches on the island of Crete. We shouldn't assume that young women naturally loved their husbands. A couple of authors summarise the context this way. In that day of formal and arranged marriages, a woman who truly and deeply loved her husband would stand out as a representative for the gospel in Greco-Roman culture. Obviously, our circumstances are very different for us today. Most marriages in Australia and in the English-speaking world are not arranged. It is still customary in some Asian, African and Middle Eastern cultures, but I suspect it's not as prevalent as it once was. The way that the Western world thinks about marriage and about romantic love has permeated cultures all around the globe. But that doesn't mean these instructions to young Christian women are less relevant. In fact, I think they're just as relevant, albeit for a different reason. Now, we tend to think of divorce as a phenomenon associated with middle age. It's people in their 40s and 50s who get divorced, people who've been married for a good long while. But that's not actually true. I'm going to show you 3 statistics that ought to cause young people to sit up and take notice. According to the Australian Institute of Family Studies, which operates within the portfolio of the Commonwealth Department of Social Services, in 2016, for both men and women, the divorce rate was highest for those aged 25 to 29 years. This means that divorce is not a phenomenon exclusive to middle age. Young people's marriages break up, and at a rate higher than older people's marriages. Statistic number 2. The largest proportion of couples separating and then divorcing are those who have been married 9 years or less. In 2017, 56% of separations and 43% of divorces were from couples in this category. So it's not necessarily the case that people get divorced after a long period of time, after decades of being together. Nearly half of the time, people have only been married to each other for 9 years or less. Again, this tells us that the breakup of marriages is also a phenomenon among young people, not just people in their 40s and 50s. And then statistic number 3, and this one is really sad. In 2017, 47.1% of divorces involved children under 18 years of age. This is the tragedy of broken families. And we know the harm it does to children. And this doesn't include all of the cases where people who are not married have children together and then separate before the children reach adulthood. I wonder what the figure would be if it included that situation. Of course, in the majority of cases where a marriage breaks up, both spouses are culpable. Both have failed the other in some way or in many ways. Rarely does all the blame belong to the husband or to the wife. But I share these statistics because they press home the importance of this text that we're looking at this evening. Young Christian women are to love their husbands because the marriages of young Christian women can break down and they can contribute to that breakdown. Young people are not immune. This is not just an older person problem. And to my dear sisters, if you are married, you need to love that man. You need to show care and concern for him. You need to show affection for him, be warm towards him. You need to pursue his heart. You need to stick by him and support him just as you would want him to stick by you and support you. You need to make sure that your heart is not being pulled away from him by things in this world or by other people. You need to make sure that the health of your marriage is not suffering because too much of your time and attention and energy is being spent elsewhere. You need to keep the promises you made to him at the altar. And of course, this goes for my dear brothers as well. If you are married, the message is the same. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. It's so obvious and so simple, but it needs to be said. God, in his wisdom, decided that it needed to be said. He put it in the Bible. Husbands and wives are to love each other. Marriage doesn't work. The family unit becomes dysfunctional. Children suffer when husbands and wives don't love each other, when they don't speak lovingly to each other, when they don't behave lovingly towards each other, when they make choices that are driven by love of self, not love for the other. Our society is reaping en masse the bitter harvest of a lack of love in this foundational relationship. If you're struggling to love your spouse as you know God wants you to, then I would urge you to get down before the Lord and plead for mercy and grace. Ask for him to change your heart. Ask for his help to be faithful in your commitment to your spouse. Ask him to help you change the things that are in your power to change. Your attitudes, your thought patterns, your demeanour, your responses, your speech. And if your spouse is hard to love because they're not doing the right thing, they're not living up to their commitment, then pray for them as well. Pray for the Lord to change their heart, to change their attitudes. God's grace is sufficient for all our needs. God can and will help us to do difficult things by the power of the Holy Spirit. Christian wives and Christian husbands can love each other and love each other well. In my study, I came across a wonderful quote from the 19th century Methodist theologian Adam Clarke. Now, the language is quite formal. We don't tend to write or speak this way today, but I think he nails this whole matter of love within marriage. See if you can follow what he says. All happiness in the marriage relation is based on mutual love. When that departs, happiness departs. No wealth or splendour in a dwelling, no gorgeousness of equipage or apparel, no magnificence of entertainment or sweetness of music, and no forms of courtesy and politeness can be a compensation for the want of affection. Mutual love between a husband and wife will diffuse comfort through the obscurest cottage of poverty. The want of it cannot be supplied by all that can be furnished in the palaces of the great. And marriages can survive and even thrive in the most difficult of circumstances if there is mutual love. You can be poor and struggling and even suffering physically in some way, and yet have deep and abiding happiness if there is this love. If you love your spouse and they love you. That's what Mr. Clark is saying here. But without mutual love, the very best of circumstances don't make any difference. You can have all of the wealth and advantages in the world and be miserable. I want to say one more thing before moving on to the second instruction in our verse, and that is, notice what comes first. Verse 4, that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children. Love of husband comes before love of children. And this is not by accident. This is the order of priority for a young Christian woman. And it is so for a couple of very good reasons. And one of them is well expressed by Kent Hughes and Brian Chappell. They write, "The apostle places commitment to one's husband first in the order of duties and highlights its priority by offsetting it in the grammatical construction of the sentence. Literally, train the younger husband-loving to be child-loving, self-controlled, and so forth. The wording is a gentle reminder that even more important than love for one's children is love for one's spouse. Because children will not readily understand the greatest of God's earthly gifts, that is, the love shared by Christian spouses, unless a mother's love for her husband is evident in the home." And that's a great quote. And we want our children to understand the goodness of marriage. We want them to see what a wonderful gift it is, and we want them to value it. And we can't assume that they'll just sort of grasp that. We can't assume that somehow they'll imbibe that message without us ever demonstrating our love for each other in observable ways. They need to see it. They need to have it reinforced over and over again. They need to know it deep down that mum loves dad and dad loves mum. They need to understand that dad is mum's number one and mum is dad's number one. The second reason why love of husband comes first is because of something I mentioned earlier. The marriage relationship is the foundation of the family unit. If that's not solid, everything else is shaky. The strength or weakness of that relationship affects the relationship between parents and children. It affects the way that children are raised. So that's the first message for young women here in our text. Love your husband. The second is, love your children. As far as I know, this is the only time in the New Testament where mothers or parents are instructed to love their children. And in a sense, it seems an unnecessary thing to say. I mean, of course mothers love their children. And yet, tragically, it was a necessary thing to say. And it continues to be. As I talked about earlier, we can imagine situations in the churches on Crete where a woman was in an arranged marriage, and her unsaved husband really only used her to provide him with offspring and otherwise lived a very immoral life. We can imagine it being hard for that woman to love her children. They weren't the fruit of a loving, happy relationship. There is also historical evidence to suggest that in the Greco-Roman world, infanticide was a common practice. Unwanted children were left to die by exposure. Sometimes little babies would be put in a clay pot or jar, put outside the house or by the roadway, left to die. And it was really only Jews and Christians that spoke against this practice and would even take these unwanted children into their homes. So we can see why Paul might have instructed Titus to address this, to have the aged women teach the younger women to love their children. But this is also a necessary word for today. Mothers can profess to love their children and have feelings of love towards their children and yet not love them. Not really. Because they're too concerned with themselves and their own lives. They're focused on doing the things that they want to do and getting the things that they want to have, and it's at the expense of their children. Their children are not loved as they ought to be. In my family circle, there are a number of teachers, some who teach children from all kinds of backgrounds. And it's heartbreaking to hear of the selfishness of some of the mothers of these children. They make decisions about money, about relationships, about the activities they will engage in with little or no regard for their children. And their children suffer. For some, they are safer and they are taken better care of at school than they are at home. Now, these mothers don't love their children. Not really. If you love someone, your inclination, what you normally do is put them before yourself, their needs above your wants. When parents don't do that with their children, they don't live up to what they say. They might say they love their kids, but they don't really. Even Christian mothers can be selfish. They can pursue their own interests, their own ideals, their own dreams at the expense of their children. What mum wants is more important than what's best for the children. And that's a failure of love. And just because we might be Christians, it doesn't make us immune from this. We have to be careful. And so, the two messages: love your husband, love your children. Now, as with our seniors, I'm very glad that the Lord has blessed our church family with this demographic, with young mums and young dads and lots of kids. It's one of the joys of being a minister, watching the kids grow up, getting to know them. There's no better place for young families to be than in the house of the Lord, to have children grow up in church. I love our young families. That's my heart. And so I hope you'll take this message tonight in the spirit in which it is given. I want God's best for families, for marriages, for children, and that means I have to be very clear about what God says in His Word. And to my dear sisters, please think about this verse here in Titus. Think about what I've shared, and let the Lord have His way in your heart, in your marriage, and in your home. Amen.